You've made every holiday about your grief, Harvey, and everyone here is tired of it, but nobody's brave enough to tell you. So I will. That's what my daughter-in-law said to me on Christmas Eve, in front of 11 people, in the farmhouse that had my name on every page of the title certificate, in a room where Jean's grandmother's clock still ticked on the mantel, and Jean's recipe box still sat on the kitchen counter, and where I had driven 90 kilometers through a December snowstorm, because my son had asked me to come. I set my mug of tea down on the coffee table. Not hard, just a small, clean sound of ceramic on old pine. I stood up slowly, the way a man stands when he has decided that the time for sitting quietly is finished. But before I tell you what I said next, before I tell you the one question I asked her, and why that question changed everything that came after, you need to understand something. There was a piece of information I had kept from everyone, not from my brother Pete, not from my old union steward Stu, not even from my son. Something I had carried for almost a year, folded once, kept in the back of my filing cabinet under a folder of old hydro bills, where I'd hoped I would never need to reach for it. Before I take you back to the beginning, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, and drop your location in the comments. I always like knowing who's out there listening. Now let me tell you how we got here. My name is Harvey Caldwell. I'm 57 years old. I spent 30 years as a licensed electrician with the IBW local in Ottawa, retired early after a knee surgery made climbing scaffolding unreasonable, and have lived alone in Canada since the spring Jean died. That was 3 years ago. She was a grade 4 teacher at Mackenzie Elementary for 22 years, and she left behind a classroom full of children who drew pictures for her funeral, and a farmhouse outside Perth, Ontario, that we had spent 12 years making into something worth keeping. We found the property the year Kieran started high school, a century stone farmhouse on 11 acres in Lanark County, about 90 minutes from the city, sitting at the end of a gravel road with a creek running along the back field, and a stand of old sugar maples that turned the kind of orange in October that you don't quite believe until you're standing under it. We paid $210,000 for it in 2010 and spent 4 summers renovating it ourselves. I rewired the whole house. Jean stripped the wide plank floors by hand. We rebuilt the kitchen with cabinets from a salvage yard in Smiths Falls, and hung the doors ourselves one Saturday in June. Kieran was 17, handing me screws while I balanced on a step stool, and we were both sunburned and tired and happy in a way that didn't need explaining. Jean loved that farmhouse the way some people love a piece of music, not because it was perfect, because it was theirs. She got sick the autumn Kieran turned 25. The oncologist used the word aggressive, and he was not wrong. We had 11 months from diagnosis to the end. I drove her to the Civic Hospital 47 times. I counted. Not out of sorrow, just because I wanted to know the exact shape of the time we had left. After she died, I kept the farmhouse. Some people told me to sell it. I understood why they said it. Every room held something. Her reading chair by the wood stove. The garden she'd planted along the south fence, which I watered that first summer out of stubbornness, and the second summer out of something I couldn't quite name. But I kept the property the way you keep a good tool, because it's useful and because some things are yours by the simple fact of what you went through to make them. Kieran met Sasha 2 years after his mother died. He called me on a Wednesday evening, his voice carrying that particular brightness people use when they're trying to disguise nervousness. He'd been working in project management at a civil engineering firm downtown for 3 years by then. She was a contracts coordinator on the same floor. They'd been seeing each other for 6 months before he told me, which I only mentioned because it was the first pattern I noticed. Information arriving late, as though it had been filtered on its way to me. I met her for the first time at a restaurant in the Glebe on a Sunday in October. She was organized in the way that people who manage things for a living tend to be, composed, pleasant, asking appropriate questions, answering mine with just enough detail to seem open without actually revealing much. I told myself I was being unfair. Kieran was 31 years old. He had been through his mother's illness and death alongside me, and he deserved to find someone and be happy. I meant that. I still do. They were engaged by the following spring. I wasn't consulted on the date or the venue. Kieran told me Sasha had it under control. The wedding was small and well managed. A Friday evening in Westboro. About 60 guests, every detail precise. I stood in the front row and watched my son's face when she came down the aisle. He looked like a man who had finished a complicated project and was relieved it had turned out correctly. My brother Pete leaned over to me during the reception. "She runs a tight operation," he said. I nodded. We left it at that, but I noticed that when the dancing started, Sasha didn't look at Kieran when she laughed. She looked at the room. 2 months after the wedding, I sat Kieran down at my kitchen table in Canada and made an offer I'd been turning over for a while. The farmhouse near Perth was worth considerably more than what Jean and I had paid for it. An appraiser I knew had estimated somewhere around $415,000 based on comparable heritage properties in Lanark County. I wasn't using it the way it deserved to be used. Kieran and Sasha were renting a 2-bedroom apartment in Centertown for $2,200 a month. The math wasn't complicated. "Move out there," I told him. "No rent, not yet. Get settled first." Kieran looked at me across the table that has a gouge near the left corner, from where he hit it with a hockey stick when he was 9, and thought I didn't know. His eyes went red at the edges. He tried to say something and didn't quite manage it. Just nodded. I called Sasha the next afternoon to go over practical things, where the well pump shutoff was, which circuit breaker to reset if the kitchen range and the electric kettle ran at the same time. "That's very generous of you, Harvey," she said. Smooth, like a sentence prepared in advance. I mentioned the title was still in my name just so she knew. It came out matter of fact, the way you'd mention a renewal date. She said, "Of course," and moved on. There was no lease, no written arrangement of any kind, just my word and hers, which I now understand are not the same thing at all. The first year, I told myself I was imagining the chill. I had always driven out to Perth on the occasional Sunday. Jean and I used to make the trip a couple of times a month, stop at the Tim Hortons on Highway 7, arrive mid-morning, walk the backfield, have lunch. I continued that habit after Kieran and Sasha moved in. The first few visits were fine, if slightly formal. Sasha was always in the middle of something, a work call, a project, something with the kitchen. "You don't have to call ahead," she told me once, "but it does help." So I started calling ahead. Then she started not answering until I'd left a message. Then Kieran started calling me back instead, usually from his truck. Kieran's birthday that first April, he turned 32. On a Friday afternoon, he posted photographs on Facebook, a gathering out at the farmhouse, string lights along the back porch Jean and I had rebuilt in 2014. Maybe 15 people, their friends Sasha's family, Pete and Brenda in the background. Pete was holding a beer and grinning. I scrolled through 4 photographs looking for evidence that I'd been invited and forgotten to write it down. There wasn't any. Kieran texted me the following morning. "Sorry, Dad. I thought Sasha had already reached out." I typed back, "No worries. Looks like a great time," and put the phone face down on the counter. She never called me Dad. Kieran called her mother Mom. Sasha had arranged that within the first few months, casual and easy, but she called me Harvey. Always Harvey. The name in her mouth felt like a formality she'd decided to maintain indefinitely. I told myself, she's private. She's still adjusting. Some people warm up slowly. Kieran texted that evening. "It won't happen again." It happened 3 more times before Christmas. When Sasha told us she was pregnant, I drove out the following weekend to Carlton Place and picked out the materials myself. In my garage, there was an old rocking chair, maple frame, wicker seat, the kind of piece my father had bought at an estate sale when I was young. I stripped it down to bare wood, recaned the seat with proper flat reed, applied a coat of natural oil finish that took 3 weekends to do properly. Jean had always said that chair belonged in a nursery. I carried it out to Perth and assembled it in the room they were setting up for the baby. Sasha said it was beautiful. She ran her hand along the arm and smiled the way people smile at gifts they are trying to find a place for. Kieran looked at it the way he used to look at things I'd fixed when he was small, and the problem had seemed impossible. That afternoon was the best I'd felt in 2 years. The baby came in late February, a girl. Kieran texted me at 12:41 in the morning. "She's here. We'll let you know when you can visit." I read that message twice. I told myself it was late. Everyone was exhausted. First-time parents communicate differently at midnight when they're overwhelmed. I drove to the civic hospital the next morning. Found the maternity ward, found the room. The door was slightly open, and I could hear voices. Sasha's mother, Glenda, was already there, sitting in the padded chair by the window, holding the baby. She smiled at me when I came in. The settled smile of someone who has arranged themselves exactly where they intend to be and has no intention of moving. Sasha looked up from the bed, tired, and something underneath the tiredness I couldn't quite name. Harvey, we're a little overwhelmed right now. Of course, I said, I won't stay long. Kieran was standing near the window. He had the look of a man who hadn't slept and had discovered he didn't care. He passed me the baby without waiting to be asked, and for that I was quietly grateful. My granddaughter weighed 7 pounds and change. She had Kieran's coloring and Jean's forehead. She was asleep and completely uninterested in anything happening around her, which struck me as the most sensible position available. I held her for 6 minutes. I counted, not out of resentment, but because I wanted to remember the exact weight of her, the particular warmth. Then Glenda stood from the chair with the practiced efficiency of someone reclaiming what's hers. I handed the baby back to Kieran, put on my coat, and said I'd come again soon. Glenda stayed for 10 days. That evening, I sat in my driveway in Canada for 20 minutes before going inside. I thought about Jean, how she would have walked into that hospital room and rearranged it around herself without anyone noticing. Made Glenda feel included rather than appointed. Made Sasha feel seen rather than surveilled. Jean had that quality. I never learned it properly. Some people carry a room. I mostly just try not to disturb one. The rewriting started quietly, the way these things apparently always do. A woman I knew from the Legion in Perth, I'd played cribbage there on Wednesday afternoons when I was out that way, stopped me in the parking lot of the Canadian Tire in September. She tilted her head at me with the careful sympathy of someone who has been assigned bad news to deliver. Harvey, I heard from Sasha that you've been having a hard time respecting their boundaries. She seemed quite worried about it. I stood there for a moment. Boundaries, did she? She mentioned it at the fall fair planning meeting. Said things had been a bit tense. I thanked her for telling me and drove home. I sat in my kitchen thinking about the phrase, respecting their boundaries. I'm a retired electrician. I make my own soup and go to bed before 9:30. I had not raised my voice at anyone in 11 years. Whatever difficult meant in Sasha's version of me. It wasn't the man who had been swallowing every small discourtesy for 2 years and saying nothing, because he didn't want to put his son in the middle of something. I gave it 3 days before I brought it up with Kieran, not in anger. Just honestly, the way I'd approach a problem at work that needed a clear diagnosis. We sat on the back porch of my Canada house, and I asked him plainly whether he'd heard Sasha describe me that way to people outside the family. He looked at his hands. She doesn't mean it as a criticism, Dad. You can just be a lot sometimes. When? I asked. Give me one specific time. He couldn't. We sat with that silence between us. It was its own kind of answer. That evening after he left, I went to my filing cabinet. Not deliberately. My hand just went there. I took out the title certificate, the one with my name printed on every page, the Perth address, the date Jean and I had paid the property off 12 years ago. I read it under the desk lamp. Then I folded it once and put it back under the hydro bills. I didn't think of it as a weapon. I want to be clear about that. I thought of it the way you think of a fact you hope you never have to use. The kind that only becomes necessary if someone decides the truth is no longer worth honoring. The summer, before Christmas, Kieran called on a Saturday morning while I was drinking coffee on the back deck. He spent a few minutes on small talk, then shifted gears the way he used to when he was 17 and needed something he wasn't sure how to ask for. Dad, Sasha, and I have been talking. We'd love to start building some equity. Is there any chance you'd consider selling us the Perth place? Below market, obviously. I set my mug on the railing. Whose idea was this? A pause too long. We both thought about it. She brought it up first. I told him I'd need time to think. He said, of course, no pressure. 2 days later, I called the real estate lawyer who had handled Jean's estate. I laid out the situation. She confirmed what I already knew. No lease, no legal claim, no right of occupancy that wouldn't dissolve with proper written notice. The property was mine as clearly as my own name was mine. I didn't tell Kieran about that conversation, but I made my decision. I would not sell. I called the lawyer again the following week to review my will. The farmhouse would go to Kieran fully and cleanly, but only after I was gone. Sasha's name would not appear on any document while I was alive. That wasn't punishment. It was just the honest shape of the situation. I declined Kieran's request on a Tuesday evening, kept it brief. It's not the right time for me, son. No elaboration. After that, the invitation stopped. Not with any announcement, just nothing. The Sunday calls got shorter, the farmhouse went quiet. For almost 3 months, I had no reason to make the drive out to Perth, because there was nothing waiting for me when I arrived. No text, no casual mention that they'd be around, nothing. I found myself missing my granddaughter more than I missed the adults. She was 9 months old, and had just discovered that people's faces were interesting. 3 months of not seeing her felt like missing chapters of a book I wasn't sure I'd be allowed to finish. Then Kieran called on a Wednesday in early November. From his cell, not the house phone, which meant he was somewhere Sasha wasn't. "Can we meet somewhere, Dad?" We sat in the parking lot of the Costco off Hazeldean Road in Canada. His car, engine off, a flat gray November sky pressing down the way Ottawa skies do from November until April. He looked like a man who had been running the same argument in his head for 6 weeks and hadn't won it yet. "She's still not happy about the house thing," he said. "I just think if you could talk to her, explain your thinking." I looked at my son, 33 years old. He had Jean's jawline and her habit of looking slightly to the left when he was saying something that cost him something. "About what exactly?" I asked. "What would I be explaining?" He opened his mouth and closed it again. There was no good answer to that. He knew it. I got out of the car, told him I loved him, said we'd talk soon. 2 weeks later, a text from Sasha. No greeting. "You're welcome to join us for Christmas. Dinner's at 4. Bring something if you'd like." I read it once, then I replied, "I'll be there." I meant it, though probably not in the way she expected. If any of this is landing close to home, if you've ever sat quietly in a room and felt your own life being described in a language you didn't agree to, leave a comment. Tell me how long you held your tongue before you said something. I read everyone. What Sasha didn't know, and couldn't have known, was that my old union steward Stu Merritt would also be at that table. Stu and I had worked alongside each other for 14 years with the IBW local, and he'd stayed close with Kieran after Jean's funeral. Sasha had invited him herself at Kieran's suggestion, thinking it would be good for me to have a familiar face in the room. She didn't know Stu had heard every chapter of this story across 3 separate dinners at my kitchen table in Canada. She had arranged her own witness without understanding what she was doing. The morning of Christmas Eve, I laid my clothes out on the bed, a charcoal wool blazer I'd bought for a colleague's retirement dinner 6 years ago. Jean had run her hand along the lapel the first time I put it on and said I looked like a man who could be trusted in a difficult room. I'd never had a better reason to wear it. I drove out to Perth on Christmas Eve morning. The back roads had a skim of packed snow. The sugar maples along the laneway were bare, branches dark and exact against the sky, the color of old aluminum. I parked in front of the farmhouse and sat for a moment. I had cleared that laneway with a rented machine for 4 winters running. I had repointed the stone foundation on the north wall. The summer Jean was in her first round of treatment. I had installed the heat pump they were using right now, on this cold night, and wired it to the panel myself because the contractor's quote was 3 times what the parts cost. 11 people would be inside today. Pete and Brenda, Stu Glenda, 2 couples from Sasha's work circle whose names I'd heard but never matched to faces. Kieran, the baby, me and Sasha, who had sent a 2-line text to the man whose name was on the title certificate to come have Christmas dinner in a house she had already decided was hers. I got out of the car. I straightened my jacket. She opened the door before I could knock. "Harvey, glad you could make it." The tone was pleasant, slightly tilted. The way you greet someone you've invited out of obligation and are mildly surprised actually came. I handed her the bottle of Riesling I'd picked up at the LCBO in Perth. She glanced at the label, set it on the entry table, and turned back toward the noise of the house. "Thank you for having me," I said. She was already walking. The farmhouse smelled like roasting turkey and the mulled cider Jean used to make on the wood stove every December. 11 people in a space built for 6 made it warm and close. I found Pete and Brenda near the kitchen doorway. Pete put his hand on my shoulder without speaking. Brenda handed me a cup of tea and gave me the look she's been giving me for 30 years, when she wants me to know she's paying attention. My seat was at the far end of the table, near the portable crib they'd set up in the corner of the living room. The baby was asleep, one fist against her cheek. I watched her breathe for a while. That was the best part of the whole meal. Sasha ran the dinner the way she ran everything, with the practiced ease of someone who has decided how events should proceed and arranged the pieces accordingly. Her friends from work laughed on cue, and offered the right compliments about the food. Glenda sat to Sasha's right and passed dishes with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who considers herself essential to any room she enters. Stu found me after the main course. We stood near the wood stove and talked for a few minutes about whether the Senators had any realistic hope this season. They didn't. I noticed Sasha register the exchange from across the room. Just a flicker. Something behind her eyes adjusted. She hadn't known that Stu and I were close. I could see the moment she filed that information away, and did not like what it meant. Kieran sat across from me at the far end of the table. He cut his food into small pieces. He did not meet my eyes once during the entire meal. The afternoon had gone without incident. In that house, uneventfulness and careful management were the same thing. I had learned not to trust the quiet. I was talking with Pete near the bookshelf when I heard Sasha's voice shift key. Subtle. The way a temperature change is subtle, until you realize you've been cold for a while. It's exhausting, honestly, she said, loudly enough to carry. She was facing her friends, but the angle was deliberate, trying to keep everyone happy all the time. Especially when certain family members make it their mission to remind you of everything you're not doing right. Glenda made a sympathetic sound. One of Sasha's friends nodded. The in-law thing is so real, she agreed. Pete's jaw tightened. He looked at me. I put my hand flat on the bookshelf beside me, kept it there. Sasha refilled her wine glass. Her voice was brighter now, almost festive. She had been doing this long enough. Small statements directed just past me, watching to see if I'd react. To know that my silence meant permission. Every time I'd gone quiet over the past 2 years, she had moved one step further. I had been training her without meaning to. She walked to the center of the living room. Stu was in the armchair to my left. He set his mug on the side table with deliberate care. I didn't look at him. I looked at Sasha. She looked at me, and then she said it. You know what, Harvey? You've made every holiday about your grief, and everyone here is tired of it. But nobody's brave enough to tell you. So I will. For one full second, the room was completely silent. The wood stove ticked. The baby made a small sound in the corner and settled again. I watched 3 things happen at once. Pete's face went still in a way I had only seen twice in my life. Kieran's fork stopped moving entirely. Glenda's eyes dropped to her wineglass with the specific care of someone who has helped set a scene and would now prefer not to be recognized as part of it. Sasha stood in the center of the room with her wineglass and 2 years of accumulated certainty. She looked at me with the satisfaction of someone who has finally said the thing they have been rehearsing for a very long time and has finally said it out loud. I set my mug of tea on the coffee table. The sound it made, ceramic on old pine, was the only sound in the room. I stood up, not quickly, not with any theater. The way a man stands when he has something to say and has decided the time has come. I straightened my jacket. Sasha, I said, before we go any further, I want to ask you one thing. She lifted her chin. Her eyes were bright with it. The certainty that she had finally crossed a line I couldn't come back from. That the room would see me either collapse or explode. And either way, she had won. Do you know whose name is registered on the title of this property? The brightness behind her eyes shifted. What does that have to do with anything? This house, I said. The one you're standing in right now. It is not Kieran's house. It is not your house. It has never been your house. My name is the only name on the title certificate, and it has been since the day Jean and I paid this property off 12 years ago. There is no lease. There is no agreement of any kind. There is only my generosity, which you just finished testing. The room did not move. Upstairs, one of the children ran across the floor, small feet, oblivious. Sasha's mouth opened, closed. Stu's head dropped forward slowly, the way a man nods when something he already knew has finally been said aloud in front of witnesses. Pete looked at Sasha and said nothing. He didn't have to. He had been waiting 2 years for that room, and he was going to let it do its work. Glenda was looking at her daughter, with an expression I had never seen on her face. Something between alarm and the particular calculation of a woman who has realized the account she was given may have been missing several chapters. I didn't come here to fight anyone, I said, but I will not stand in my own house and be told that I am the problem. I let that sit for a moment. Then I went to find my jacket. No one moved for a long time after that. You could feel people in the room doing the arithmetic, running back through 2 years of holiday hosting. The casual way Sasha had mentioned the deck renovation she was planning for spring, the coat of fresh paint on the front bedroom, the raised garden beds she'd put in along Jean's fence line, running it all back through the new information and arriving, one by one, at the same uncomfortable answer. Then Kieran stood up. It was the first time all evening he'd risen without being asked to help with something. He stood the way a man stands when he has been underwater and has decided to surface. Sasha, his voice was quiet, did you know that? She turned toward him. The confidence she had carried to the center of the room had begun reorganizing itself into something defensive. Of course I knew it was his property. That doesn't change. Did you know we had no legal claim to it? That if he'd wanted us out, we'd have had to leave with 30 days' notice? That's not the point. Then, what is the point? Sasha looked around the room. One of her friends had set her wine glass on the mantel and crossed her arms, the way you do when you've decided you'd rather not be involved in what's happening. Glenda's expression had shifted into the resentment of a woman who understands she may have been given an incomplete account of things. Nobody moved towards Sasha. I picked up my coat from the chair where I'd left it 4 hours earlier. Jean's old barn jacket was still hanging on her hook beside the front door. I had not moved it. I put my blazer on, button by button, in the quiet. When a room is paying attention, buttoning a jacket can carry a great deal. At the door, I stopped. Kieran was still standing in the middle of the room. He had his mother's jawline and a look on his face I hadn't seen in 2 years. Not anger, not embarrassment. Recognition, the specific expression of a person understanding something they should have understood much earlier. Call me when you're ready, son. I opened the front door. The December air came in cold and direct, wood smoke and frozen creek and clear sky full of stars. I stepped outside and pulled the door closed behind me softly. The way you close a door when the anger has gone out of it. Just a finished thing. From inside, a moment later, I heard my granddaughter begin to cry. The clear, uncomplicated cry of a baby waking up with no agenda at all. Just the simple announcement that she was there. I walked to my car. No one came out after me. I want to step outside the story for a moment. I drove home that Christmas Eve not knowing what would happen next. Part of me was prepared for the worst. For Kieran to choose silence again. For everything to harden into something permanent and cold. But there is something that happens when a true thing is finally said in a room full of people. It doesn't disappear. It just sits there and waits for everyone to decide what to do with it. 4 days went by. No call from Kieran, no text. I didn't reach out either. I had said what I needed to say. The next move wasn't mine. I cleared my driveway, finished a book I'd been meaning to get through since September, made Jean's chicken and vegetable soup on Friday morning. The recipe she'd written on an index card that I have memorized so completely I no longer need to look at it. But I got the card out of her recipe box and set it on the counter anyway, the way I always had when she was alive. Pete called on the 28th. He told me Glenda had been busy. A version of Christmas Eve that positioned the entire evening as Harvey's unprovoked attack on a daughter-in-law who had done nothing but work herself to exhaustion feeding 11 people through the holidays. What did you tell people? I asked. That I was there, Pete said, and that I have 2 working eyes. I appreciated that about my brother. He has never once complicated the truth by adding to it. On the 29th, a message arrived on Facebook from someone I didn't recognize, one of Sasha's friends from the dinner. The first sentence was enough. I blocked the account and went back to my soup. It affected me a little, if I'm honest. Not because of what the woman said. She hadn't been at the hospital, hadn't seen the birthday photos on Facebook after the fact. Had no idea what the past 2 years had actually looked like from where I was standing. But because it meant Sasha had been on the phone within 72 hours, building her case with the tools available to her, that took a certain kind of energy. I found it briefly exhausting to think about. Those nights I didn't sleep well, not from regret, not from anger, from something quieter and harder to name, the specific worry of a father who has done the necessary thing and doesn't yet know what it cost him. On the 2nd of January, there was a knock at my door. Kieran looked like he hadn't slept properly in a week. I opened the door and stepped to one side. He came in the way he used to come in from school on hard days. Quietly, coat still on, needing a moment before he could speak. The way he'd come in when he was 13 and a kid at school said something cruel. When he was 17 and the girl he liked chose someone else. He had always come to this kitchen the same way, quietly, needing a minute. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table with the hockey stick gouge near the left corner that we had never fixed and never would. I didn't ask him to explain. I put the kettle on and got out 2 mugs. Jean had bought them at a pottery market in Almonte years ago. Heavy stoneware, dark blue glaze. I'd replaced nearly everything else in the kitchen after she died. Never replaced the mugs. He spoke first. Dad, I don't know how I let it get that far. I sat down across from him. For the first time in 2 years, I didn't choose the version of the truth that would protect him. I told him what the past 2 years had actually looked like from where I was standing. The birthday photographs I found on Facebook after the fact. The 6 minutes at the hospital while Glenda sat in the comfortable chair. The woman at the Legion in September telling me Sasha had described me as difficult at the fall fair planning meeting. The Sunday calls that had gotten shorter and shorter until they were mostly just me saying I was fine and meaning it less each time. I wasn't angry when I said these things. I was just accurate. There is a difference, and he could hear it. Kieran listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sat with it the way he used to sit with hard math problems when he was young, with concentration, not defense. Why didn't you say something sooner, Dad? Because I kept thinking you'd find your way back on your own. He nodded slowly. Then he looked at the gouge in the table. I'm sorry. I know, son. We sat there while the tea cooled between us. We didn't fix everything that morning. There was too much of it. And Kieran still had to go home to a conversation I couldn't have for him. But we found the place to start from. That was enough for that morning. It was exactly enough. 3 weeks later, I had my lawyer send a formal letter to Kieran and Sasha, written plainly. They had 60 days to sign a lease at current market rate, $1,950 per month, based on an appraisal of comparable rural heritage properties in Lanark County, or make arrangements to find alternate housing. The letter included the lawyer's contact information if they had questions. The letter was not a punishment, it was a description of reality. We had been operating inside a fiction for 2 years, and I was done pretending the fiction was fine. Sasha's response came by text 2 days later. The language was scorched. Accusations of cruelty, of retaliation, of a father-in-law who had never accepted her. I read it once, put the phone face down on the counter, and did not reply. Kieran called me 10 days after that. His voice had the tiredness of a man who has been arguing more with himself than with anyone else. We'll sign the lease, Dad. I told him okay. He said it wasn't how he'd wanted things to go. I told him I knew that. The lease was signed the last week of February. I took every monthly rent payment and put it directly into a bursary fund through the college in Perth. The one Jean used to tell her students about when they were too old for grade 4, but not yet sure where to go next. I named it the Jean Caldwell Bursary for Student Educators. I didn't tell Kieran where the money was going at first. When I finally did, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, she would have been mortified by that. He meant it as the highest possible compliment. He was right. 3 weeks into March, Kieran called on a Sunday morning and told me what Sasha had said. She had drawn a line clearly, him or his father. She framed it as a reasonable request from a woman who had been humiliated in her own home, except it wasn't her home, and what had happened at Christmas hadn't been humiliation. It had been consequence. I kept that thought to myself, because Kieran hadn't called me for my analysis. He'd called to tell me his answer. I said no, Kieran told me. I told her he's my father. I'm not cutting him out. I sat down at the kitchen table. I hadn't let myself expect that, or I had hoped for it for so long I'd stopped letting myself hope, which isn't the same thing. How did she take it? I asked. Not well. We're seeing a counselor. I don't know how it'll go. That was the most honest thing Kieran had said to me in 2 years, and I told him so. I hadn't raised my son to choose me. I had raised him the way Jean and I had both tried to know the difference between love and control. For 2 years I had watched that distinction get blurred until I wasn't sure he could see it anymore. He could see it now. What happened between Kieran and Sasha after that was not mine to manage or predict. Some things mend. Some things reach a workable arrangement both people can live inside. Some things end quietly. That was their story to write, and only they could write it. I hoped they had enough light to see by. Kieran called again the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. By April, we had gotten back to something that felt like a rhythm. Pete and Brenda came for dinner on Friday evenings, the way we'd done for years before Jean got sick, and everything else reorganized around something I couldn't fix. Pete brought beer. Brenda brought bread. I made whatever was in the refrigerator, which turned out to be enough. The house in Canada felt different in ways I had to think carefully about before I could name. Then I understood it. It felt like mine again. It had always been mine, legally, technically. But somewhere over the past 2 years, I had started adjusting myself in my own kitchen, leaving earlier than I wanted to, saying less than I thought, editing myself down into something that took up less space and asked less of anyone. I stopped doing that, mostly without noticing. Kieran started bringing the baby over on Saturday afternoons, just the two of them most weeks. She was nearly a year old by then, and had discovered that walking toward things was considerably more interesting than being carried. She moved through my kitchen like a small, extremely determined explorer, treating every low cupboard and drawer pull as a matter of urgent scientific importance. I put Jean's photograph back on the shelf in the hallway. I had taken it down 18 months into Kieran's marriage. Sasha had glanced at it once with a particular quiet that I hadn't liked, and I'd moved it without quite admitting to myself what I was doing. Told myself I was being considerate. That wasn't the whole truth of it. I put it back on a Tuesday morning in March. Jean in her garden at the Perth farmhouse, summer light, squinting slightly into the sun. She was 49 in that photograph. She had no idea what was coming and looked completely at peace with things, which is exactly how she moved through her life and exactly how she left it. I don't know what will happen between Kieran and Sasha in the long run. I genuinely don't. Some things mend. Some things reach a functional arrangement both people can live inside. Some things end quietly. That is their story, and only they can write it. But on Saturday afternoons, my granddaughter stands at my kitchen window and points at the chickadees on the feeder. Like each one is a small miracle she cannot believe she has been allowed to witness. I sit down beside her on the floor, and I agree with her completely. People ask me whether I regret waiting as long as I did. Honestly, I'm still not sure. Part of me thinks that if I had pushed back sooner, Kieran would have closed up and the whole thing would have hardened faster. Part of me thinks that 2 years of silence was a form of enabling I had convinced myself was patience. I don't have a clean answer on that one. What I do know is this: staying quiet is not the same as being weak. There are real reasons a person holds their tongue, love, mostly. The particular fear of damaging something you cannot repair. I stayed quiet because I loved my son. That was true, and it was mine, and I'm not going to apologize for it. But there comes a point when your silence stops protecting the people you love and starts protecting the people who are hurting them. That point, for me, was Christmas Eve. I didn't plan what I said. I didn't rehearse it. I didn't walk into that farmhouse with a strategy. I walked in with one fact I had never used. A single piece of information folded once in the back of a filing cabinet. And I used it only because someone's not decided in front of 11 people, in a house with my name on the title certificate, to tell me that I was the problem. I set my cup down, I stood up, and I asked one question. The rest, the lease, the bursary, the long Sunday calls, the Saturday afternoons with my granddaughter at the window, none of that was planned. It happened because once the truth is in a room, everything else has to arrange itself around it. That's what I keep coming back to. The truth was always there. It just needed her to say that one thing for me to finally let it be known. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think I was right to wait as long as I did? Or should I have said something sooner? Leave your answer in the comments. There's no wrong answer, and I read every single one.